All right, awesome. Thank you for joining us today for our latest fireside chat. I'm Andrew Weiner, Head of Partnerships here at iComply. iComply is a global software provider of KYC and AML identity and risk management solutions for client lifecycle management of financial institutions, capital markets, corporate professional legal services, banking, and so much more. These fireside chats are where we bring together a panel of our partners and some industry experts, some close friends of ours that have excellent insights into the topics that we address around compliance for KYC and AML implications around the globe. Before we jump into everything, I'd like to take a moment and give them the opportunity to introduce themselves, starting on my right with Amber Scott.
Hi, I'm Amber. I'm the founder and CEO at Outlier Solutions in Canada. We're essentially compliance geeks, meaning that we try to keep folks out of trouble, and our practice is specifically Canadian.
Awesome, thank you. And just following counterclockwise there to Chris.
So I'm Chris Krent. I am from MME. It's a law firm in Switzerland. I specialize in compliance as well, but the firm covers legal, tax, and compliance. And I'm also part of the Crypto Valley Association, so I'm head of the AML task force there. So
thank you. And Georgie.
Yeah, my name is Georgie. I'm a partner at Kohler Gotzev, a law firm in Luxembourg, and we mostly advise investment funds, financial institutions on compliance, KYC, and AML matters. Also FATCA and CRS automation, investor self-declarations, and more generally consultancy on design and implementation of digital onboarding systems, mostly designed for complying and helping VASPs in the current regulatory framework.
Thank you, Georgie. And for our audience, if you're tuning in from YouTube, you can actually use the Q&A section to submit questions for the panel that we can answer as we go through today's chat. You can also tune in on LinkedIn Live, and where we're also streaming, I believe, on Twitter and Facebook. Today, our topic is from nomination to verification, how to digitally onboard a corporation. And we're specifically taking a look at the onboarding burden with relation to a legal entity. But to begin, I want to cite a recent study by a research agency called Loudhouse that took a hard look at this exact subject. And they found currently 6 in 10 of the senior staff working in any financial institution are spending a minimum of 2 days of their entire work week trying to onboard new legal entities as their clients. Using, on average, at least 4 identifiers and multiple systems, this process of onboarding the client, including the required know your customer due diligence, is taking them a minimum of 6 weeks to complete. So when we consider AML D5 and FinCEN's CDD rule, verifying the identity of your customers, partners, and suppliers is completely unavoidable. So let's talk about that. What's happening between day 1 and week 6? The challenges, the best practices, your own experiences in this area. Now, for our first question, I'm going to throw this one to Chris to start. We mentioned nomination in the title of today's chat, but in the world of AML, when it comes to onboarding a legal entity, who is a nominee?
A lot of terms that are used in terms of identifying who is in charge, who can represent, who can sign for a company. Nominees are traditionally individuals, natural persons who can represent either another person or an entity, either as a director or a shareholder, and basically represent the voice of that company locally. So there are very good and legitimate reasons why you might want to appoint a nominee. For example, if you want to establish an offshore company and you need a representative on site. But there's obviously a lot of reasons why nominees are used as well, which may be not so transparent.
Thank you, Chris. And we have an international panel here, so I think this next question is a great place to jump to. We'll start with Georgie for this one. In financial services, regulations outline the KYC requirements for how these natural persons and the legal entities that they're representing, such as corporations, can be identified, verified, and screened. These regulations do change from one jurisdiction to another. What does the KYC onboarding process for legal entities look like today in your market?
Well, in Luxembourg, which is part of the European Union, we have a big stake of the regulation, which is coming from the the national transposal of EU regulation. So I think it's pretty much alike all other European countries. Mainly what we're looking at is we don't have specific provisions of how to do it and what we need to identify. Typically, when we have a legal entity, what we will be looking to identify are the ultimate beneficial owners or the controlling persons. So without saying what we need to collect, we know what is the target and what we're aiming at. So that being said, it's something which is basically done on a case-by-case basis and depends on the AML programs each institution is implementing. But we have a starting point where we need to identify the corporate entity, or maybe it's an unincorporated entity. And then starting from that, we will typically look for partnership agreements or constitutional documents, and then identify who are the people that are representing legally the company. And that's going to be basically the starting point. And then in order to see and have this look-through approach of identifying who are the ultimate beneficial owners, being natural people, we will have to also have an oversight of seeing whether there are all other entities behind that legal entity, and ultimately who are the natural persons that are holding this entity for more than 25%. So it seems complex, as you said, and that probably gives an explanation from day 2 to week 6, all the things that you need to take care of.
That actually amplifies the timeline for sure. You know, Amber, across the pond for you in Canada, how do the requirements compare to what we just heard from Georgia and Luxembourg? What is it like in your local market?
I think it's very similar in a lot of ways. So from a Canadian perspective, we're looking at what we call confirming the existence of an entity. So you're looking for some kind of document that shows that this entity exists. And by that, it doesn't mean a screen cap of their webpage to say, oh, it looks like this is what they're doing from a business perspective, but some sort of official document. They've also changed what happens around that to make it be something that's recent. So the idea is that if you're talking about confirming the existence of an entity that's been in existence for 20 years, you wouldn't necessarily want their certificate of incorporation because a lot has changed since then. So you'd be looking at something like a more recent filing, whether if it's a corporation and they're incorporated in Canada, either federally or provincially, then they would have a filing that they do every year. So you would look for something more like that. You're looking for information, again, about the beneficial owners. For most reporting entities, that's at the same 25% threshold. For securities dealers, that actually hits a 10% threshold. So it's a lower threshold within that industry if they're looking at their own corporate clients that don't meet requirements for exemptions. But I think there are going to be similarities for most FATF countries, FATF member countries, but some real differences in terms of the minutia for what's required, what documentation can you actually use, and then what's available for that jurisdiction. One of the biggest challenges that we find is when you have to confirm something through an independent source. And so the idea there is that you're not just getting a form from the company that says, here's who our beneficial owners are, but you're using some kind of document or database to confirm that information. And that is quite often not readily available.
And I'm sure that that's a common challenge. You know, Chris, in your market, when you run into a problem like that, when you're having difficulty verifying via an independent source that even the representative that you've begun talking to is authorized to begin these processes with you, what are some best practices there for the audience that would like to, you know, do that extra due diligence and ensure that who they are accepting this information from is even an authorized representative of the entity?
Right. Well, I mean, in Switzerland, definitely there's an obligation, or a compliance officer has the obligation to make sure that they know that the person that they're speaking with is authorized to speak on behalf of the company. Hello, am I still there? Hi.
Had
Sorry
a
about that.
short refresh. Now, the last thing I heard you said that the person is authorized to represent the company, and then we had a quick flash.
Yeah, sorry about that. So you want to make sure that that the person who's speaking to you can speak on behalf of the company, that they are working with either a power of attorney or some other document that gives them the authority to represent the interests of the company and to sign up or one of them. And sorry, I have
I have you.
I have a connection problem here, it seems. So I think in terms of best practices, one of the things that is very difficult in this field is understanding the differences between what a beneficial owner is and a representative who may be acting as a nominee and representing the interests of the company. And so very often companies who like to have a little bit more privacy will appoint a nominee to speak on their behalf. And then it's sometimes difficult for the compliance team to know the beneficial owner or if they're speaking to a nominee. And so that takes a little bit of digging. And some of the kind of documentation that you can ask for there is just basically anything that gives you information on the company itself. So that could be, the statutes or information that you might get from a public source like, a registry, a company registry. But you can also ask for company structure information. It's not necessary to always understand the entire structure of the company, but it's certainly important for you if you're trying to dig deep and try to understand how the company is structured, who is the ultimate beneficial owner, and who is just acting either as a director or a nominee of the director.
And that leads into something I'd love to ask Georgie here. As you're doing this digging, Georgie, aside from the representative that first brought the entity, what other stakeholders, and we mentioned a few of them, would you engage when doing the onboarding to complete the entire screening process?
Well, typically, as Chris mentioned, we will be looking nominally from a certificate of good standing on extract from the company register, which is, let's say, dating from less than 6 months to identify who are the directors and who are the people that combine the company. So besides that, if we have put aside the representatives which we have identified and have information about them, typically sometimes you need to have additional information and use also service providers such as iComply or maybe law firms and external compliance officers that are providing support to businesses that are involved in financial services, because especially if we take a step back in financial institutions, you have AML programs which must be compliant with enhanced due diligence and have this proportionality principle. So if the company is a trade and business company, which is straightforward, you can identify the shareholders. It's a transparent entity where you can see them from the extract of the trade register. It's pretty simple. But then when we go into more complex structures and where you have different entities, various that can be constituted of a group, then you may be jumping into an onboarding which triggers an enhanced due diligence, and there you might have to use specific professionals that are going to help you basically identify what is the overall structure of the company, how these all these entities are linked, and ultimately if there are some entities which are acting as intermediaries just to kind of break the transparency of the ultimate beneficial owners, that'll require really very sophisticated intelligence in order to be able to recoup the information from various jurisdictions. And ultimately, I'll say in some financial institutions in Luxembourg that we have advised, we see that even when you go into these kind of structures which are complex and not transparent, this basically triggers not a red flag but an escalation process where you start identifying people that even hold sub 5%. So it may require typically external compliance officers, lawyers, and technology companies that provide access also to overall information where you can access that very quickly.
think
Now, Amber.
Oh,
Let's
if
please.
if I can jump in there, I think one of the other concepts that we haven't really touched on is the idea that there can be certain roles that are prescribed within law. So, Chris, you had mentioned situations where someone is just a director, but within the context of Canadian law, that would be someone on whom you have to collect information, because our law is very specific to anyone that owns or controls, directly or indirectly. So there's the idea that whether it's through a secondary company or trust or any other thing, that still, if I own or control 25% or more of that entity, then I am considered to be a beneficial owner. And there does have to be some level of information collection. And that's a thing that can make people very uncomfortable in those situations where they want to be more privacy protective, or they've set up specific controls to be more privacy protective. A refrain that I find myself repeating often is that the law doesn't change for high net worth individuals. The law doesn't change if you're famous. The law doesn't care how many Twitter followers you have. It doesn't care how much money you have. If you're a person that needs to be identified under the law the way that it's written, it is what it is, and there's no exemption for that.
You nailed it. And I've seen celebrities, and I'm sure we've all seen it, like Akon, who got involved in virtual assets and things like this, where they just ran afoul of regulations and rules. They were promoting, unregistered securities offerings. And it all came very much so true, what you just said there. Well, I'd love to open this one up for the whole table, because we've talked quite a bit about this representative going, collecting information, gathering it from them. When we're doing the due diligence, though, are there any cases that you can think of where you had encountered a representative who actually was not authorized to represent the legal entity that they were trying to conduct business between you and them with? How did you catch it? And when you did, what had to be done? Whoever wants to take a bite out of that one first.
You want to go first on that one?
Sure. I've definitely seen fraud cases that started that way, where there was someone that was trying to set up accounts on behalf of a corporation. And the more that there was digging into what this looked like, the more it became apparent that this just really wasn't someone that was even necessarily affiliated with the corporation in any formal way, let alone having the ability to do business on behalf of. And those become really interesting cases, I think in particular where no funds have necessarily been transacted. So you don't have a situation yet where you would necessarily phone to notify the corporation that funds have been stolen. So there's not a theft there yet where you might initiate direct contact with the police, but you can see where this piece is going. And from a financial institution perspective, you're aware that if you're not the financial institution that opens this account, they're probably going down the street to the next place. And so you also get into that information sharing between institutions where it's possible to do that about this fraud attempt that's in progress.
No, what I'm curious about is, how did you catch it in that scenario? Was there, a glaring issue in documentation? Was there something that had been, clearly tampered with? Or, the audience here today is currently probably onboarding legal entities as we speak in their process. Maybe they're on week 3 of 6. So I'd love any additional insight that you may have that they could leverage to potentially catch this on themselves in a future case.
I think a bit of luck, to be quite honest. They were representing themselves as being part of a big enough corporation that had a significant local presence and a significant web presence. And so one of the things that got noticed very early on was that they had provided an address that wasn't linked to that company on anywhere on the company's website. They'd provided a phone number for themselves at the office, which did not look like the format for those phone numbers. They had provided an email address that was just off in a weird way. So for instance, if I was a representative of Coca-Cola, I might have an @Coca-Cola address. I wouldn't have a, Amber_Coca-Cola@gmail address. So there were enough of these little things that just didn't line up that eventually, when the representatives had sort of called the company to say, hey, we'd like to speak to this person, no such person was found, and things really started to unravel at that point.
Inconsistencies in data.
I think that's where the whole two-factor authentication sort of comes in and can be really beneficial if you have like a digital onboarding process that that has an element of verifying, that the individual is actually either physically at a location, or that does have ownership and control of an email address that's associated with the domain of the entity. That can really help to sort of solidify some of the things I've seen. So in Switzerland, we have quite a few crypto banks. Well, we have 2 currently, and a few more will be. I think Kamala Harris's fly is on my shoulder. Sorry. We have a couple of banks that are going through that too, and they're onboarding a bunch of VASPs and are sort of virtual asset service providers, so crypto companies that are in the space. And there's so much fraud, and the extent to which companies go to impersonate crypto banks is extreme. And one of the only ways to really improve that and work on that is sometimes with snail mail in very high risk cases, and do some sort of physical checks. So either you pick up the phone and you call the number that's given, and you have some, a number of different checks, but you have to use your judgment. And of course, the catchphrase that we all like to use, you have to use a risk-based approach. So if it's a company that's very visible, and the individual that is contacting you is well known within the space, you can have a high degree of reliance, that you can use a certain level of due diligence that's commensurate. But at the same time, if you have a company in a high-risk jurisdiction, et cetera, then the extent to which you have to go to be sure that the nominee or that the representative really is responsible or has the authority to do that, and is representing a bona fide company is much greater.
Georgie, I'd love to hear, some of your experience as well as you're running through the due diligence and you've kind of tripped over some people that may have not been who they said they were.
Yeah, we haven't had that many directly, but typically, as Chris said, is first of all, we have sometimes matching address, corporate addresses, matching websites, matching email. Typically, the first step in doing that is looking into the headers of the emails. When you go into more metadata, you can see that basically there you just have some masking of the email addresses, and then it turns out that it's something else on a different domain. It shows on your email system like it's a real one. And most often, the thing that saves a lot of time is basically ringing up the number, and then when you ring up the number, it says like, yeah, the cell phone that you're calling doesn't have any more whatever kind of credit on it, so you can't even leave a message. So typically that's kind of thing which is kind of ringing the bell immediately, even if we've seen very nice and very beautiful fake emails. Also, ringing corporate is something that we typically do. We just ring and say, can we speak to that person? It's like, but we don't know that kind of person. Then we just go to compliance and forward the email and let's look, your system has been hacked. People are using this email corporate, sort of fully qualified the domain name. And we've had a couple of other interesting things, which when we are advising on digital onboarding systems for entities, is that typically where some issues come to be more relevant and like more obvious, is that you can be able to get a pack of corporate documents, which if you don't have video identification, or at least ID authentication as iComply has or other service providers have, you can end up actually having nominally bylaws, extract, up-to-date, matching IDs, everything perfect. And then all of a sudden you go on to the investor self-declaration form, and then you just get some kind of company that is stated as a passive NFFE, and then you say, wow, that's kind of very sleek and nice. And well, could you please give us the background fact checking that you have to do when you're doing FATCA compliance on a W8 Benny? And it's like, oh yeah, well, yeah, we'll get back to you. And when you want to have, actually they say, yeah, but we qualify as that because, that's typically what some people do. Is they choose the passive NFFE because it's just the easiest one to kind of put forward. Although I would have advised use a startup one. If you have less than 3 years, it's more easy to to demonstrate that you're basically in a status where you're kind of comfortable. But yeah, when we ask for financials and kind of look at what kind of level of income is generated by non-financial and financial income, that's where it stops. So sometimes it's useful to, even if it's not strictly speaking an AML for a legal entity, we highly advise, and that's why we integrate. I'm looking at the screen for the CRS and trace self-investor declarations as an ultimate step before basically onboarding people, because that's the one that makes the difference, because you need to check the ISD against your own KYC and ML. That's what financial institutions are supposed to do. Most of them don't do it because they're not aware of what is the approach of performing it. But yeah, sometimes that can help to comply and also to basically identify where you are facing fraud, because they just come back up the W8 Benny or whatever form they have filled up.
And right where you've kind of landed there, this is coming from the audience now. It's a great segue to the next question. For Chris to start, how are these challenges solved differently in face-to-face transactions versus today, where we're all mostly remote, doing these online user experiences to verify these individuals and these legal entities?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot more automation in online, and you can do some checks, in real time, basically with online sanction screening and things like that can happen quite quickly. But obviously in face-to-face, you can have a higher degree of certainty that the person that's in front of you is really the person who's provided you with the ID piece that you're verifying. So, very often there's some additional requirements when you're doing either a correspondence onboarding or an online onboarding or video onboarding. In Switzerland, we have the 4 methods, so in person and all the other ones I mentioned, and each one of them is quite particular in terms of what the particular requirements. So, for example, if you're doing an online onboarding, our financial market regulator requires you to do a bank account transfer because they want to have a high degree or higher degree of certainty that there's another financial intermediary somewhere who has vetted that person as well, and that person has a bank account and can then transfer assets. So it's super onerous for individuals, but it does give you a high degree of certainty that that person is who they say they are. So I think.
On that same question, is there anything that just simply cannot be done remotely, or is always something that you could investigate digitally?
Well, I mean, there's the manual step of really verifying that the person is physically, or who they say they are. I mean, but with technology today, with 3D facial recognition scans, you can almost verify
testing.
Yeah, liveness testing as well. I think the only thing is a verification of the legal entity's address. Is a bit of a challenge sometimes, and sometimes you have to do, if it's high risk, you may want to consider a snail mail, package that you send and they return, a verification code, for example. And that's not obviously a very digital or pragmatic way of doing things. I think it really depends on the risk appetite.
But this is what Google does when you're looking to list your business address on Google, is they will physically send you a piece of mail that has a code on it, and you have to receive that mail at that address and enter the code before you're verified as being at that address.
Banks as well, right? If you're opening they have to do that. I think another really good best practice that I found is very useful is certain financial market regulators will establish like a list of all the different documentation that's required in each jurisdiction, so that a company can establish itself and what you can expect to find in that jurisdiction. And so these lists are not always public. For example, in Liechtenstein, the Financial Market Authority there has these kinds of resources not available online, but on request. And that helps you, for example, if you're onboarding somebody from Bolivia, to know, what kind of documentations you can expect to find in a public registry and what you can rely on, or what you should be able to rely on, because every jurisdiction is different. And I think that's a huge challenge, because we can't always rely on public registries. Even registries that you would think are a bit more robust because they have a bit more information, like UK Companies House has, a lot of information on who the beneficial owners are and so on and so forth, but it's not always very accurate. So I think starting with understanding what a company or a legal entity can give you or should be giving you for that jurisdiction is one step. And the next step is verifying the authenticity. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking for a certification or corroborating it with information that's available online. So for example, do they have a bona fide website? And, if all else fails, you can also ask for a statement from a law firm or another authority figure within that jurisdiction that helps to assuage any of your concerns. So there's sort of a lot of escalation steps to give you more confidence with regards to the quality of the information you're getting from your client.
And across the pond there, again, back to Canada, same question. Is it as onerous as the Switzerland rules to go remotely with the verification in Canada compared to face-to-face? Or what does that look like, Amber, from the Canadian perspective?
So our guidance, and most of the guidance from the Financial Action Task Force, guidance from FinTrack, I think pretty much across the board at this time is saying that you need to consider non-face-to-face channels as being riskier than face-to-face channels. There are components of that I think I fundamentally disagree with as technology improves, which is to say that depending on what your face-to-face channel was, if it was me showing up with an ID and paper documents, both of which can be relatively easily forged, and no additional checking of the background of those things, just an assumption, oh, looks good, looks like you, next. That's a really weak face-to-face KYC. And I think that your digital processes, when done correctly, can be much stronger than that and much better at risk mitigation. So when you do have things like the liveness testing, so I've held up the ID, it's scanned and pulled the information from the barcode, it's comparing that to what I've actually given you, it's looking at my face digitally, and I have to do this liveness testing. So look left, look right, smile, frown. Is this face the same face that's on the ID? Frankly, I think that the digital tools that we have to do these things are so much more effective than humans. And I say this as a person who's bartended. I've definitely looked at enough IDs where I think it's probably you. But I think that's a very difficult human function compared to some of the ways to do that using technology. Similarly, in jurisdictions where you have some type of possible electronic verification against a database, I think those are incredibly powerful tools to say this corporate registration exists, it's up to date, the address matches the address that the customer has given you. Sometimes you have names of directors listed, often not. Sometimes there's beneficial owners listed, often not. But that's one of the things that we're looking at Canada-wide is how do we start to approach beneficial ownership registries? And how do we start to get more transparent with this information so that there are reliable sources for verification for entities that need to do these types of verifications? We're not there yet. But I think that there are tremendous strides that have been made towards really effective electronic verification.
And Georgie, in your market, would you say that you're most similar to Swiss regulations and with Chris there, or is it slightly different there in Luxembourg for the type of identification and risk screening you would have to do? How does this differ now that we've gone remote from your traditional in the office face-to-face transaction?
Well, for professionals of the financial sector, so that's basically financial institutions that are regulated by a financial supervisory commission, remotely, in order to enter into a customer relationship, for entities, you need to identify the director, at least the ones that have a signatory power to bind the company or the entity or the partnership or whatever. So we've seen with COVID-19 that even the Luxembourg Digital ID Authority, which is LuxTrust, jumped on a process which is video identification onboarding, And the very interesting thing is that they didn't develop the video identification themselves, but they delegated it to a third-party service provider, like a tech company. And what it's interesting is that the CSSF, the Luxembourg regulator, had already basically published a position to whom a financial institution or professional in the financial sector can sub-delegate AML authentication via video chat. And it ends up that Lux Trust, who is which is actually the authority that delivers qualified electronic signatures, outsourced that to that European company, which is also regulated into different other countries. So the standard is, if you're doing that level of onboarding, you need to basically use the only major established provider in the European Union, which is kind of restricting a lot of the options, because you can only sub-delegate such process to an entity which is under equivalent supervision as the one that you are yourself. So if you're a bank, you need to, well, if you don't outsource it to another bank, you need at least to be outsourcing it to an authority or a company in another country which is supervised by an entity of the financial sector. So this is kind of complex, because the fintechs, they kind of use, or the electronic payment institutions, they use things which are not, let's say, compliant 100% with what a bank would have to do if they do this kind of account opening. So you have the disparity between the levels of requirement of an electronic payment institution and a bank, which kind of isn't the actual level field is not exactly the same. So at least for banks and financial institutions, it's clear that you need to outsource it to another company which is regulated in the same way or equivalent to yourself. So this is kind of the standard in Luxembourg. And then for other types of relationships, you can still rely on digital identification, which is more ID authentication check, liveness test, and then maybe having selfies and subsequent things. Although the identification in such a way for directors or authorized signatories is not always required by the law, but it's rather left to the financial institution or the person that is subject to AML to determine in its AML program how to address these kinds of situations. Because you always hit a threshold above which you still need to have the video identification if you want to keep those customers. So it's a question of, if you're transacting 50, 100, 1,000, okay, but then when you hit high intensity transactions, 5,000 and plus within a month, then you have to go through the video identification. And if you don't have the proper training tools, backup systems, archiving to run that process yourself, train the people that are actually the operators that are doing that, you're basically not eligible. So you need to outsource that if you want to continue onboarding digital people for that level of transaction. So it's kind of a two-step approach, but from what I know from Switzerland, there are similarities in the processes. But Chris is the specialist there.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we have as well is that there's a loosely worded requirements that in the not the regulation, but the guidance put out by our Financial Market Authority on onboarding, on who can conduct video authentications. And there they expect the person who's doing it to be speaking to the person on the other end in real time. And so there's different ways of interpreting that. And I think, we can sort of be creative and add some talks with the regulators about how it's quite limiting, actually, because if you do want to outsource that service to a company that's in another jurisdiction, your clients are in several different jurisdictions, it's just not realistic to expect that you would only be able to use services that have 24-hour round the globe service. So it's always nice when you can have a video recording that you can review, and for low risk cases, have somebody, an expert, assess the liveness and assess the authenticity, and then follow up with the client later on with EDD, enhanced due diligence, additional investigation as needed. So that's a bit of a challenge that we have here, but otherwise the requirements are very similar as in Europe.
So we've talked quite a bit about, these steps and processes between face-to-face and remotely to actually onboard the representative and then, of course, the entity itself. Once you have that in your system, and the question from the audience came in was, how often would you need to refresh the KYC data on a legal entity? What are these thresholds and parameters and risk attributes that help you in your different jurisdictions decide when do we need to review this again? How do we monitor this going forward? And I'll start with you, Amber, and then we'll go around the table.
So isn't the right answer always, it depends? It depends on the prescriptive requirements in each jurisdiction. In the absence of prescriptive requirements, because we don't really, as far as Canada goes, have very specific prescriptive requirements. So there is the understanding that you will update the information. You will update it in a way that is risk-based. So if I've assessed a company as being high risk, the idea is that I'm going to refresh that information more often than I might for a company that isn't high risk. And a really interesting example in our banking sector is that banks will often consider money services businesses to be high risk. And that includes VASPs and companies of that sort as well. So they might receive on an annual basis a questionnaire, and part of that questionnaire asks whether anything has changed. I think it's important to supplement that with other things. And so where there are corporate databases that you can ping to say, is there a change where the company might not have notified me, or a disparity between the information that I have and the information that's publicly available, as well as media monitoring, particularly in those high risk cases. I think that's fairly important. But there's definitely an expectation from the regulator that you will see that more often for your higher risk entities than you would for an entity that's considered low risk.
So I can only echo that. It's not prescriptive here either. It's really risk-based approach. I think a good rule of thumb is if it's sort of high risk, you want to be looking at that every 3 to 6 months. If it's sort of medium risk, it's every 1 year to 3 years. And if it's low risk, it's every 3 years. But I mean, it depends on both the risk profile of the client. So, what kind of risk level you've rated them at, and the risk appetite of the VASP or the financial institution. I mean, if you're a bank, you may have a different categorization than if you are an MSB or a VASP.
Georgie, anything unique to the Luxembourg market that would dictate, that type of cadence for keeping the data current, or at least reviewing the data that you have?
Yeah, no, as already explained by Chris and Amber, is that it's always depending on your program. You need to determine what kind of risk the entity that you're onboarding represents for the business. So typically it would be beyond kind of automated checks and kind of notifications where you have expiries of any kind of legal documents, firewalls. But typically for legal entities, best practice would have is that we expect to have extracts from the trading company register or a certificate of good standing every 6 months at least, which is kind of a minimum for what we advise. And then randomly, it can be something that it could be one in the policies that we have is 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, depending on the profile. So 5 being for the low risk entities. But generally, there is a clause where when you accept the terms and conditions of the financial institution, you commit to update of any changes that may occur in what you have represented to the business. And the one that is mandatory is the FATCA and CRS, which needs to be done at least once every 3 years.
Awesome. And as we near time here, I wanted to thank the audience so much for hanging out, asking questions in the YouTube here, and querying these brilliant minds that I was able to assemble for this wonderful panel today. But I wanted to wrap up with one question that's more of a kind of a personal reflection, because the audience is really curious. Who has spent that proverbial 6 weeks that London House was mentioning of verifying a legal entity? And maybe to enhance this question, what is the longest you've spent trying to onboard a legal entity? Are there any stories you can share where there was just considerable due diligence, where you felt kind of like a private detective or a real crime fighter?
So I you had this in your summary that you sent us in advance, and I gave a lot of thought about whether I should answer this on account of, I think it makes me look sort of bad, but also I think it's going to be relatable for a lot of folks that are doing onboarding. Going back to really early on in my career when I was in a compliance analyst role, part of my job was onboarding these companies, and a company came in. They had an advisor who would essentially be the way that we describe a representative or a nominee in this context, that was much older than me. So I'm in my early 20s at the time. Very wealthy, well-known individual who did a lot of yelling at me and berating me for not onboarding them fast enough. But I really wanted to make sure that I did a good job. It was one of my first, grown-up jobs. And I had over 100 pages of charts with the different entities and how they were related based on the information coming in. Some of them were circular references. I didn't know yet that that was a red flag, an entity that's owned by an entity, and it just makes a circle somewhere in the chart. And so I had these pages and pages and pages of charts with how these entities related to each other, but I just wasn't there in terms of what I had to follow according to company procedures to understand the ownership structure of these companies. And so one day when he was done yelling at me, this advisor called the VP, who was my boss's boss's boss, to yell at him about the fact that I hadn't finished this onboarding yet. And it had been, we're probably near the 6-week mark at this point, and there were just reams of documents on my desk. And so the VP, Phil, calls me into his office and he says, Amber, I just got a call from this guy. He's really upset. This is unlike you work-wise. So what is the story? And I brought in my 100-page chart of documents and here's how these companies are related. And Phil looked at it and said, Amber, we're not onboarding this. This is such an opaque structure. This is terrifying. This is more risk than we would ever be comfortable with as a company. I'm going to call this advisor and let him know that we're going to shut it down. And it was just really eye-opening to me, because at that level, I had just considered follow step 1 and then 2 and then 3 of the procedure. And so I was trying to cure this crazy company structure by following the procedure. And it hadn't even occurred to me, oh no, they might be completely outside of our risk tolerance based on their crazy structure.
That's an excellent story. Thank you. Anybody else want to take a bite and share with our audience, who I'm sure right now is going through hundreds of pages of legal entity paperwork, identifying stakeholders and trying to do their best there? Let them know that they're not alone.
Definitely not alone. I had a case where, it was exactly this. It was a nominee that that was representing a Swedish-based company, and everything seemed very legit. I mean, I had a power of attorney that was signed by the authorized signatory. I verified that the person who signed the power of attorney was, had the authority to do so, was registered in the company register. We had all the company documentations, but something sort of seemed fishy. Just by the elusiveness and the delays with the response for the additional documentation that we were asking for. And, just basic Google search ended up finding out a little bit more about the structure than what was given to us that was represented originally. And ended up finding out that, actually, the UBO that they had mentioned to us, or that they had declared to us, was a different person. And so it's quite a complex situation, because here you have a nominee who seems legit, who's provided information about the UBO who was incorrect. And the ultimate UBO ended up being a sanctioned person. So it was a bit of a lucky hit, because we dodged a bullet there. But, it takes a lot of experience sometimes. And that's not to dissuade anybody. I think actually, more than experience, it takes gut feeling, listening to your gut feeling. If something seems untowards, you should definitely try to hone in on that and look a little bit deeper.
It's very instinctive as you kind of pour through documentation when things aren't lining up in the way they should, when you have so much data to pull from. Georgie, anything from your side of the pond that you'd be willing to share on this?
Yeah, big common sense. I mean, you need to follow the MO program, but as Amber said, is once it starts to be a 26, 27 entity group and kind of not so transparent, it can happen in Europe. I mean, last time I had to deal with something, it was 3 months and it involved 3 jurisdictions in Europe, and it took us 3 months to get just the structure chart. So beyond that, it's just obvious that the compliance officer needs to escalate that either to his chief compliance officer, or just even check that with, well, maybe not the front office because they want to sell, but definitely chief compliance officer, escalate, and then just check, yeah, I've got 26 entities. What do you think about it? Is that the way things happen? And usually even that's just where it stops, because you're not going to spend 10, 15, 20,000 euros on CDD as the account is not. These are discrepancies which just don't tick all the boxes. And we've seen also in designing and improving onboarding automation systems that, depending on how, it's just the opposite of what you do on a website where you want to sell. It's just you design the system in such a way that you just want to kick out the people that are trying to fraud as early as possible in the system. So the way you structure even auto identification, video identification in the process, maybe video ID could cost 50, 60, 70 bucks. But if you put it straight in the beginning, it can save resources in-house, compliance officers, external advisors, just to run that check again and go through registers and call for their experience. So this is really, you have to hit where it hurts in the beginning so that people say, wow, this is step 2 in the onboarding process. They're already asking for that. Wow, this is kind of, and this is also an approach really common to extensive experience. And if you don't have it, just escalate the matter, and most probably the person above you is already familiar with these kind of things, is going to say, yeah, this is just outside the scope of our policy. We don't commit outside rules of engagement, full stop. So you save everybody's time, not 3 months.
Mm-hmm. And that's why services like yours are really welcome, you know, in the space. And in particular, what I like about you guys is that you have so much experience in terms of, you know, what's legit and what's required in the various jurisdictions. And that's not easy to find. You know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different services that have 1 or 2 AML or KYC onboarding simplifications or automations. But you guys really have a really good comprehensive, and it's not a cheap plug. I really mean it. I was really impressed at how comprehensive it is, and also how much experience you have. So it's a pleasure to be working with you guys, and to, you know, to refer our clients to you.
You guys are the best. I appreciate all of you. Before we wrap today, I'd love to let the audience know that next month we're going to be expanding on this topic. We're going to dive deeper and take a look at UBOs and shareholders and stakeholders on the next fireside chat. But to wrap up with today's group, just going clockwise here, starting with Amber, please let the audience know where can they find you online, your website, your email, however they can reach you. Take a minute to plug yourself. The floor is yours.
Sure. Outliercanada.com or at Outlier Canada on any type of social media that I happen to use, including Twitter.
So we have MME is mme.ch, and I'm on LinkedIn. So Chris Schwent, check me out at LinkedIn.
Yeah, so www.corrigotsu.com, and on LinkedIn, that's going to be a quick one.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I appreciate all of your time. I hope the audience learned some very valuable knowledge and insights and got some best practice out of today's call. I do look forward to having everybody back for the UBO follow-up in about a month. I will be posting a link with those times and dates shortly. But for the rest of your week, please have a good time, enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, George, Amber, Chris. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.